So, hello everyone. Welcome to Jane Friedman. Sorry, um, Jane. I have been following you for many, many years, back from when you were at Writer's Digest, and so you're kind of like a famous person in my world. I think you're a famous person in a lot of people's world, but just so you know, um,
A micro
I
celebrity. Yes.
yes, you are. You are. Well, not macro in my world, micro maybe in the larger context. I don't know. But thank you so much for coming.
My
Really.
pleasure.
It's a real gift and I'm super excited and I have a lot of ground to cover, I feel like. I mean, you share so much freely and actively. So there's just not nearly enough time to like ask you all the questions, but I just first want to thank you for sharing so freely and openly, with all that you know and that you come across, and it just seems like it comes from like a desire to like just some from such a good place to desire like a desire to share and help us grow as a community of storytellers and publishers. And I mean, I think you call yourself like a publishing and author advocate, right? Isn't that how you refer to yourself? And I really feel that.
Yeah, I see my mission as to educate authors and advocate for them, especially in an industry that can sometimes be standoffish, opaque, and unfortunately predatory. So the more people like myself and others can share information freely about what's happening, I think the more we're all protected.
Mm-hmm. What does that mean? Such an interesting, extreme word, predatory. What do you mean by that?
Well, there are a lot of dreams in the writing and publishing community, whether that's the dream of getting a book published, the dream of earning money, the dream of getting seen in certain places. And so there are a lot of services, individuals, even publishing companies that will dangle out this hope, dangle out some
Mm-hmm.
aspect of that dream and ask you for a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
And then you don't get anything in return for that money, or you get something that's far less than what was promised.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with Jane Friedman, I just want to also just give a little sort of recap or bio of who you are. So, you've spent at this point nearly 25 years in the book publishing industry, working with authors and publishers. Yes.
That's right.
And um, you're also the editor of the Hot Sheet, which is the essential publishing industry newsletter for authors, which I can attest to from people that I are in my circles, feel the same way. I feel that, they say that it's really the only place that they're getting certain information, and they really rely on it, in terms of what's happening in the publishing industry, how it's evolving, like so quickly. Um, you were named the Publishing Commentator of the Year by Digital Book World in 2023, and your latest book is The Business of Being a Writer, which received a star review from the Library Journal. Um, and you also work with organizations such as the Authors Guild to bring transparency to the business of publishing. So, The Business of Being a Writer was published initially in 2018,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
That's right.
I find it kind of like, I don't know, not surprising, but interesting to note that you're already doing an update just a few years later. So, I mean, what 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 areas of the book itself are you really focused on, or is it the whole thing? Is it like a page one rewrite? Given how quickly
Honestly,
things are changing.
yeah. I mean, it would have been easier to write a new book. Part of me wishes I could have just written a new book. Um, yes, I mean, I touched basically every page. Um, because a lot of the details are different, I had a huge section on magazine publishing, digital and online media that bears little relationship to the year in which I wrote it. And I also just wanted to make some changes. I since that book was published in 2018, it really means the bulk of it was written around 2016.
Mhm.
So the way I think about the industry and how I think writers should approach it, that's also transformed. And so the book has been restructured. And I've added more information too about self-publishing that wasn't in the first edition, although it still definitely leans strongly in the traditional publishing direction because it's used in creative writing classes where a lot of the expectations around writing and publishing center on moving ahead with traditional publishing. That's becoming less and less the case, but that's still largely what writers are looking for.
Mhm, mhm. So can you give us a little sense? I mean, like I said, I've been following you since you were at Writer's Digest years ago. I mean, can you give us a sense of kind of like your own trajectory of how you even landed here to be, it feels like such a resource for so many of us. I'm gathering that wasn't the plan necessarily.
I, you
So
know,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I've had one or two detours. But I did start out working in the publishing industry from day one. I was interning for publishing companies while I was still in college. I ended up working at a mid-sized publisher in Cincinnati to start my career. And I stayed put for 12 years. And so that was the foundation. And it was an exceptionally formative experience because the company I worked for wasn't a book publisher only. It was also a magazine publisher, an education company, an event producer. So it had a lot of different moving pieces, and I was able to see the bigger picture of how you serve communities. And so Writer's Digest was part of that company, but just one small part. And so I did also have experience in other communities. When I left, I went into university teaching, and I figured I would just stay there for the rest of my career. But I was offered an opportunity to go back into publishing, specifically with a literary journal. And so I spent a couple years doing that. And then that position unfortunately didn't work out that well. So I ended up going full-time freelance. I figured, well, I can do some work freelance while I find my next job. But the freelancing went so well that I never stopped. So that began in 2014. And so now this will be my 10th year.
Wow. So you went into university. What was it that drew you back into publishing? Because you said, "Oh, I thought that I'd just be in the university system for the rest of my life." I mean,
Right. Well, one of my contacts knew about my expertise in digital media, social media, the transition that was taking place. So this was in 2012. For those who might not remember what was happening at that time, this was around the time BuzzFeed launched, self-publishing was picking up speed, Twitter was exploding, social media was still kind of new, and there was still a lot of innocence surrounding it. A lot of literary journals and magazines were starting to have app editions release. I would say it was a time of optimism, unlike today, very different time. And so I was recruited to join this literary journal staff. And it was a journal I knew of and respected. It was an award-winning publication. And they needed to basically relaunch the digital piece of it from scratch. So they needed a new website. They needed a digital edition. They needed social media accounts. They needed an email marketing strategy, et cetera. So I did that. And then left after 2 years. So that's, potentially I could have stayed longer, but, things don't always work out the way you think.
mhm, mhm. So so you were known as like a digital expert, and
Yeah.
where does that come from? Is it like a passion or is it that where are you, because that seems to be kind of where it started for you to really kind of sink into this expertise that has kind of grown
Yeah.
in scope.
Sure. Yeah, I've always leaned in the direction of playing with technology. So, when I was a kid, my favorite thing to do in the classroom was use the computer when there was any free time. Um, I asked for a computer as soon as my mother could scrape together the money to buy one. And then I promptly, broke it.
Oops.
uh, like by wiping the hard drive, and then I had to have it
Oh,
all
shoot.
reinstalled again. Um,
Did you open it up to like see how it worked?
I didn't. It was just but it was certainly something that I probably would have done more with, but I just didn't live in. I grew up and went to school in rural Indiana. And as you might imagine, and this was in the early 90s, there weren't a whole lot of resources if you wanted to get into computers more than buying your Tandy from Radio Shack. So yeah, that interest has always been there. And when I was at my first publishing company, um, I experienced the transition from print to digital, and many people didn't get it, or they were scared, or they thought it was a fad. But I never felt any of those things. I've never felt any fear from
Mm,
technological change.
mm,
Um, Certainly, we can be skeptical, but I'm not afraid of it.
mhm,
So, yeah, I've always felt like if there's a new tool, if there's a new something, I want to know about it. I want to
mm,
experiment with it, and I'll draw my own conclusions about whether or not I can use it.
mhm, mhm. So then how, because I do remember early on the newsletters that I followed of yours really focused on like the new apps or the new things
Mhm.
happening in technology. Um, and now it has really grown largely into the publishing and authorship space. Like, is that how you view it? Am I getting that correct? Or
Well, you're
how do you?
probably thinking of a number of different things that I do, which because I do probably too many things, it's easy for them to become conflated.
Got it.
So I have a free newsletter that's called Electric Speed
Mhm,
that really looks at, okay, so what are some new tools, services, technology, and things that can help you in your creative life? And
mhm,
so you might be thinking of that's my longest standing newsletter.
mhm,
Um, and it will always be free, and it's probably always going to have the biggest readership. Um, and then my paid newsletter is really about the business of writing, the business of publishing. If you want to make money, in particular, if you want to succeed in the industry, then you probably need to be aware of which way the wind is blowing, what other people are doing to succeed, um, what new companies are on the horizon, how you might profit off of your work in the future, what AI might do to that future, et cetera.
mhm. Got it. Okay. Okay. So you are still like focused on the apps and that,
Yeah.
that aspect, digital aspect. Okay. So how do you keep your finger on the pulse of all of these things that perhaps you like? I just saw a post that you recently did. I don't know if how recent it is about like TikTok and book. What is it called? Book talk? What is it?
Book talk, yes.
I mean, the way you write about some of these things is very immersive, and and detailed. And I'm imagining, is it just through a lot of research, or are you actually using all of these different things? And how are you staying on top of all the things?
Well, I'm a pretty voracious consumer of the media generally, news outlets, other commentators. A lot of the updates that I get on a daily basis are strictly newsletter oriented. So I
Wow,
I produce newsletters, and I love consuming newsletters,
got
which
it.
is a really good thing to pay attention to in yourself. Like, what is it that you're avidly consuming? And
Mm,
does it match what you're avidly producing, or vice versa? So, one of my secrets is that I'm actually, despite my association with book publishing, I don't read a lot of books. And I'm not, I mean, at one point in my career, I did consume a lot of them, but a lot of it has shifted into the newsletter space. So I'm reading as much as I ever did, if not more.
I
It's just
see.
taken a different shape. So newsletters and some mainstream media like the New York Times, or the Tangle newsletter. Um, but if you're engaging with people in the community, even if you're not reading these newsletters, like if you're checking in on your favorite social media network, whatever that might be, and if you are friends with certain authors, agents, or editors, I mean, you're going to see the conversations about whatever the
Mm-hmm.
hot new thing is. And
Mm-hmm.
so I pay attention to that. But I
Mm-hmm.
will say, with Book Talk, TikTok, it's very trendy right now. I'm not saying it's like a passing fad. It's been around for quite a number of years at this point. But I don't post TikToks. I'm not interested in short form video. So I'm just offering an example of, yes, that's hot, new, and trendy, and a lot of young people are there, but it's not for me to go and create them. It doesn't interest me. I don't consume TikToks. I'm not going to make TikToks, but that doesn't stop me from looking at how it's shaping book publishing, how it's shaping marketing, what
Mm-hmm.
authors are doing there. I'm still interested in that, but it doesn't mean I have to go participate in it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So one of the main sort of ongoing resources you offer for free is this key paths to book publishing. Not sure if I said that exactly right. Is that the
Close
correct
enough.
title?
Yep.
Okay. Which I am going to just post in the chat here. It is such an amazing sort of overview of what is happening, what options authors have in terms of publishing their books, whether that be traditional through a small press, through a hybrid press, self-publishing. And you've added, I think, a new column recently, which I thought was so interesting. What was the last? Is it social?
Social. Yeah.
Social. Um, so, I mean, this is a pretty, I feel like this chart or sort of layout is a pretty democratic kind of presentation of the different options. And I was wondering if you have more, strong opinions about which ones to focus on, which ones are that you support the most. Or is that a terrible question to ask because you're meant to be a democratic sharer of things? I just imagine you have some opinions about these different options. And I'll tell you one of my biggest questions, maybe to help direct that question a little bit more, is the hybrid world is, I feel like, a really interesting, so a hybrid press, and maybe you can define that for people, what that means. But I just feel like it's a business model that is generated on getting books published. Like that's the way they make money, is sort of to churn out books. And ultimately it makes me question, you know, is that a valid business model in terms of quality? And are there certain hybrids that are more discerning um, in terms of the quality of books they put out?
Right.
Or is it inherently sort of a quantity business?
So when I look at that chart, I like that you use the word democratic because I do try to lay out the options without putting them in a hierarchy or indicating one is more important or valuable. I do think everything here depends on the project. It doesn't even depend on the author. It depends on this project at this time, what's the best path for it.
Mm-hmm.
So every single book you approach or you're thinking about, you have to think about what's the right approach for that title right now.
Mm-hmm.
So I've done self-publishing and traditional publishing. I've done social publishing. I haven't done hybrid. And you have raised, the topic that is the most contentious part of that chart and among the most contentious when I'm dealing out in public, when I talk about publishing paths. I can almost guarantee if I publish an article that even just barely touches on the hybrid publishing path, all of the different tribes are going to come out with their own argument about why it's good or why it's bad. So there are definitely authors who use hybrid publishers and have been successful at it. And I think it was the right choice for them or the right choice for that book at that time. However, the issue here is that hybrid publishing as a term is so squishy that all sorts of companies use that term to describe what they're doing, and it has lost meaning. And bottom line, a lot of people end up using hybrid thinking that it's somehow better than whatever the alternative is when it's not. And you have to understand that hybrid publishers don't stay in business unless the authors paid the bills. And it's the same model as the so-called, I hate the term, vanity publishers. If you go back decades, that's what this model was called, vanity publishing, when you paid to publish your book. Now, hybrid publishers, whether they're legitimate or not in use of that term, they will tell you, well, we're different because of these reasons. And the reasons are usually, we don't take everyone who wants to publish with us. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. But you also have to understand there's already a filter in place. They can only publish the people who have the money, who can write the check. And for some hybrid publishers, we're talking about $10,000, $20,000. So that's going, once you filter out the people who can't pay, they're taking a very high percentage. They might also say, well, the hybrid is different today because, we offer you better royalties, or we get your books distributed in certain places that wouldn't have happened in prior generations, or we really apply quality control, and et cetera, et cetera. But still, regardless, I think any author who is considering the hybrid path, they have to do the math. Your goal may not be to make money with the book, but you should at least know what you're spending and what you might profit if the book does well, and ask yourself, would I be better served going another path where maybe I pay less upfront? Maybe I don't have the distribution the hybrid offers, but I'm keeping much more, 100% often of the profits. Mm-hmm. So again, just do the math. Don't get sucked in by the so-called prestige or status factor. I think that's a lot of what they sell themselves on. And that's what worries me about it, that authors think it's somehow helping their image. And it's a really hard call to make because it's going to depend on the company and it's going to depend on the book. But just be aware that one of the ways that they get you in the door is by giving you this feeling of, finally, someone has accepted me. That feeling of validation, of being given the green light. Maybe you've gone through countless rounds of rejection, and that feeling of relief, oh, somebody wants me. They're really capitalizing on that. I'm not saying they're evil to do it, but it's a very human nature sort of thing that we're talking about.
And the author themselves also might not. I'm just thinking about the quality of like what actually gets put out there. Like, I just wonder in the long term if the authors can stand behind the books that get put out. But I suppose that's.
Well, I think one of the challenges here is that the hybrid will only go so far as you pay. So, for example, a very well-regarded hybrid publisher, She Writes Press, if you're accepted and you pay for their basic package, that doesn't include editing. So if the product comes out and you're not happy with the quality, who do you get to blame? You kind of have to blame yourself because you didn't pay for it. And maybe they told you to do it and maybe they didn't, who knows? But the burden is on you at the end of the day for the quality coming out of the process. I mean, we can talk about whether all of us agree or are happy with that, but some people are choosing hybrid because they're not arguing about whether the book is good enough to publish.
And a lot of times an author might even feel that it is, on that level,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So, so there really are less checks and balances or in that process,
Right.
and different competing, I guess, interests. You didn't use the word predatory, but I sort of heard that in the in
Well,
between
it's,
the lines.
I think it
You
can
don't have to
prey.
say it. You don't have to say it.
So, some of the companies are predatory, but others, I think you just with even with the best intentioned hybrids, I think sometimes what they're selling is this feeling of I've been accepted.
Yes,
And this is going to be a
makes.
better quality than if I self-published. And that just be very just know what you're walking into. Know that
Mm-hmm.
that psychological game is out there.
So important to hear. Obviously, platform is a big topic that you you talk about. I'm sure. I feel like you might say the same thing as the paths of publishing. That it's different. How someone builds a platform is different depending on who you are. Um, can you give maybe some examples of, if that is your kind of take, what how you guide authors in that, how to think about it?
Yeah. So we really have to talk about genre and category differences when we talk about platform and getting agents or publishers interested. So if you're a first time, and I use that word very deliberately, first time author, you don't have any books on the market yet. We can leave the self-publishing piece of this for later because that will just complicate the picture. First time author of a novel or a children's book, not YA, children's. So like picture book, middle grade. I would not be worried about platform in the sense of I need a social media following. I need to show that there are people ready to buy my book. I've got a big newsletter list, et cetera, et cetera. I would be thinking about that in terms of who are the people in my community or in my life that are going to support me when the book comes out. What are the connections, the relationships are really important for any writer. You don't want to launch your book alone. But in terms of will this agent or publisher accept the work, the novel or the children's book, they're going to make the decision based on the manuscript. And I know there's so much confusion and misdirection around this, because there are some really bizarro agents out there and some bizarro publishers that will talk about having a platform for fiction or children's. But I think you should see them in exactly that light. They are outliers. It's the exception to the rule. And maybe you don't want to go publish with those places. Now, it's going to be very different if you're not first time. So if you're not first time and you already have a sales track record, your sales track record is kind of part of the bigger picture and part of the platform. And if you didn't sell very well, then the publisher or agent is probably going to be thinking about, well, why don't you build your platform some more? Because we don't expect your next book to sell that well, since you're kind of at the same, you haven't increased your visibility even after you've published a book. So when that first book launches, you have to be ready to capitalize on it and show that your readership is growing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Now with nonfiction, and memoir is a gray area I'll get to in a moment. Nonfiction that's not memoir, you do have to have a platform for the very simple reason that people generally don't want to buy your book unless they kind of feel like you have some credibility or authority or experience that makes a difference to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, I just want to emphasize this doesn't mean social media following necessarily. It could be that you were the former anchor for CNN.
Mm-hmm.
It could be that you used to be the president of the Red Cross. You were the CEO of a business. You used to be the mayor of Cincinnati, et cetera, et
Mm-hmm.
cetera. Like people who have positions, people who have had influence, people with strong relationship networks. That's part of platform too, and it's often overlooked. There's also the sense that platform, some parts of it are very invisible. Like there are some writers who win awards and get fellowships and go on retreats and know certain professors or are part of certain literary networks that just give them a leg up, and people inside publishing know this, although you on the outskirts of these communities might not know that.
Mhm.
Um, so that's all part of what we talk about when we talk about platform, the ability to get your book in front of people, or to get yourself in front of people in order for that book to sell. If you're
Kind of like
writing,
it's kind of like where you have leverage, right? Like
yes,
kind of.
that's a very good way of thinking about it.
Mhm.
Yes. Now, memoir is a really difficult area because agents and publishers look at memoir differently depending on the sort of book that it is. So we all know that celebrities get their memoir deals. Prince Harry is not going to have any trouble writing and publishing a book on whatever he wants. It could be a children's book, it could be a diet book, doesn't matter. It's going to be published. um, and the same is true of anyone, like a politician, someone who's notorious, someone who has 15 minutes of fame, like Captain Sully, who landed a plane in the Hudson. Like, these people get book deals, and often they don't even write the books.
Mhm.
So there are publishers and agents that are all over those projects, and the projects that are just ready made for media attention, and the author has a platform. But then there are, of course, there are countless memoirs that get published by people we have never heard of. Educated by Tara Westover is an example. Who had heard of her before that memoir was published? I mean, I certainly hadn't. I'm not even sure she had published an essay to her name. So you do see those sorts of memoirs get accepted. But, there's often something really astonishing about them. It could be the writing, it could be the voice, it could be they come from a very unusual background or situation. They're taking us into a world we have never entered before. So, like I just read I read a profile of a woman who spent 500 days in a cave. This was in the New Yorker, if anyone wants to go read it. And of course, if she wanted to write a memoir, I bet she would get a deal. And she's someone who like lives off the grid, basically in a camper. She doesn't have a platform, but she has done something remarkable that people are probably fascinated by, and they want to read that story. So
Mhm.
she gets to publish her memoir.
Mhm. Well,
um,
I saw the article that you wrote. I think it's part of kind of your sample hot sheet offering. The hot sheet is the paid newsletter.
yes.
And she gives a sample to that you can read. And in there, you have an article about memoir, and you did some
Mhm.
research on the memoirs that were published in 2022 and found essentially, well, what did you find?
So about 1/4 of the memoir deals were for people without a name, a known name, who clearly just sold the book on the basis of the story or the writing, or there's some quality about the work or the story itself that sold it.
Mhm.
I could find no evidence of an online presence, news attention, media connections, and so on.
Mhm.
Another quarter of the deals were for, platform influencer sorts of people, media adjacent. You could strongly see why.
Mhm.
Another 25 established authors, people who are just continuing on with their career, hopefully going to write another successful book.
Mhm.
And then another quarter is the celebrities and politicians and so on.
Mhm. Mhm. So, okay, so you've kind of given an overview of kind of what, like, how to think about platform depending on what kind of book you're writing and who you are as a writer. Can we zero in specifically on, because I loved your take on this whole newsletter versus social media, and your most, recent article you put out on Substack
Mhm.
specifically,
Yeah.
um, which it was so informative. I just loved everything. I'll put it in the chat. I did put in the memoir research for 2022 deals in the chat for people who are here. And Jane recently wrote this piece on Substack. And what I took away, which has always been my, I've always just published a newsletter. So I have always had a hard time with kind of building the social media um, piece of of things. And the newsletter feels just more organic to me and something that I can control versus I just feel like, oh, I'm going to get into, Facebook and then suddenly Facebook's obsolete, or I'm going to get into Substack and then Substack, it's already changing. I think people are noticing. So anyway, my takeaway was that the basic newsletter and connecting with your readers is you feel is super valuable and not to be underestimated. But you're also incredibly active on various social media, and you're also part of a lot of conversations, and you're sharing something like this Substack article. So I have a couple questions. One, what is your own relationship with social media? Do you ever consider that idea that, oh, you're posting this on LinkedIn, and then a year later you invest all this time on LinkedIn and building your audience there, and then it shifts or changes, and then that goes to waste? Or do you feel like we as writers and entrepreneurs need to adapt and like, oh, so be it. In a year's time, well, then you just got to bounce over to Substack, or you got to bounce over to the whatever the new thing is.
So this question comes at a pretty interesting time, I think, for all of us, because social media is in a great amount of upheaval right now. And for me, especially because my number one social media outreach tool for almost 15 years has been Twitter. And I stopped using it in October. I didn't shut down the account, but I have stopped engaging there.
Mhm.
And that hurts. I part of my career was made because of Twitter. I won't go into all of the stories. You can dig around and find them if you look. But so many good things came to me because of Twitter, and so it's heartbreaking not to have that anymore as a channel for conversation. So do I consider it wasted time? No, absolutely not. I'm delighted I had it for as long as I did, but then it helps to have a Buddhist philosophy here, which is it's all about change. You accept that. So I've actually been enjoying Threads quite a bit, which is basically Facebook's ripoff of Twitter. LinkedIn has been okay. Surprising amount of engagement there that I wouldn't have had even several years ago. And Facebook keeps chugging along. So, those are the key places that I'll talk about the things that I'm publishing or, respond to comments. And, I used to be a little more consistent with Instagram, not so much anymore because I'm just not into the visuals or into the videos. I'm very text driven. And so what I would encourage everyone listening is it's okay to play to your strengths. You don't, again, just because everyone's saying, oh, it's all pivot to video, or it's all about images or whatever. I mean, to some extent, yes, visuals can be important, but it's not everything. So go where you can sustain the activity. Otherwise, it's not going to have any effect if you burn out or dislike it. That dislike is going to come through.
And do you change your voice depending on whether you're on Threads or LinkedIn or Facebook? Are you aware that there's sort of slightly different audiences?
Oh, yeah, I'm aware. It's different. And it's not like I can give you, I can give folks like, this is how I do it on Facebook and this is how I do it on LinkedIn. It's just that my networks are slightly different. And I don't know what everyone else's is like, but I imagine, with Facebook, conventionally speaking, that's where you tend to have the family members or the high school friends, and so, and for me, this is not an insult to anyone who's friends with me or follows me on Facebook. It tends to be more lowest common denominator when we talk about the publishing community. Whereas Twitter, it was really like fast paced and you better keep up. And you would expect to be interacting with people really in the trenches of the industry. So I would use different language and I would use different types
Mm,
of anecdotes or stories, or I'd point out very different things in those two communities just because I know that who's listening is very different.
hmm. So are you still spending, do you have any kind of guidelines in terms of how you spend your days or your time? Or do you just sort of have an internal kind of sense of structure to your days?
So I kind of have what I would call a 2-week cycle. And that's partly because of my newsletter cycle is every 2 weeks.
Mm,
So there are things that are sitting on my Google Calendar that like this, like I definitely know that I have to allot time for this today from a meeting standpoint or a class standpoint. And then I have a series of to-do items for each day. It might be writing an article for the newsletter or editing a piece or prepping a class marketing page, something like that.
mhm,
So I definitely have to-do items in addition with the meetings or appointments each day. And so every 2 weeks, I plan out what's going to happen. And
mm,
then usually after Hot Sheet, the paid newsletter sends on Wednesday. That afternoon, I set the schedule for the next 2 weeks.
mhm, mhm. But in terms of your like social media posting, is there any rhyme or reason
Oh, I
to,
see.
sorry, maybe I wasn't specific enough.
No, no, I am not. I'm not one of those people that commits to showing up certain times a day or scheduling in advance. I approach it organically. If I don't have
Hmm.
time for it, I'm not there.
Hmm. Got it. Yeah. But you're a computer friendly person, so I'm sure it just organically kind of, yeah, you find your way to it.
Definitely if I have like heavy deadline work, the
Mm,
last thing I'm going to do is open up social media when I
mm,
sit down at my desk because you look up and an hour has just passed and I was
right.
supposed to get something done. So
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
usually save it for when the important duties are finished.
Right, right, right. So let's talk about your book, The Business of Being a Writer, a little bit more. And just this, first of all, it's such a useful book, so needed. I mean, I don't think there's any other book out there with this kind of focus. Are you aware of any others that
I
are
mean,
as
there are definitely,
comprehensive?
yeah, there are definitely books that focus on aspects of it, but I don't know that I know of a book that's looking at how do writers make money,
Hmm.
because it doesn't usually happen through book sales.
Hmm.
Spoiler alert.
Right. And by the way, Jane is super transparent. And do you consider yourself like in that category of writer and how you're making money? Yes.
I
Okay.
do.
So you're
Yeah.
using yourself as sort of like a test case. I mean, in the sense that she shares very openly, and I don't know if I have the link on me right this second. I don't know if you do, Jane, but she does a breakdown of how she makes money, what categories and how it's evolved over the years. I find it super, again, just this whole money making business of being a writer. It's like you said, it can be so private and people reluctant to share, and you're just like out there sharing like so transparently about your own experience. So I think there's fundamentally, the way we think about making a living as a writer is off. Yes.
Generally, yes.
And in what ways? Let's start there.
um, I mean, I'm going to make an assumption that people want to earn money off books. That's the common expectation that I see. And so I think that, especially if you're a first time author and you get that first deal, um, if you're lucky enough to get a sizable advance, and by sizable, like let's say it's $100,000. Let me be clear, that is not average. Average is probably more in the 4 figures, low 5 figures, not a living wage. But if let's say you do get something that could be a living wage for maybe a year, once you divide that advance up into 3 to 4 installments, deduct the agent's fee of 15% if you had one, and then taxes, it doesn't get you very far. And 70 to 80% of books don't earn out the advance. So most people cannot count on book sales alone. the way that self-published authors generally make it work is through volume. So they're publishing a really significant number of titles in a fairly short amount of time, at least when compared to traditionally published authors. Traditionally published authors make it work either because they're getting sizable advances consistently. So if you look at an example like Chris Gillibo, he's a nonfiction author who writes book after book after book and consistently gets a decent sized advance, and I have to imagine has some good backlist sales at this point. And by backlist, I mean sales from older titles that keep chugging along.
Mm.
So if you have someone like that who can be, again, consistency is key here, to consistently produce the books,
Mhm.
sell well enough that you can do the next one if you're traditionally publishing, then you can usually fill in the gaps if you're traditionally published with speaking, teaching, and things of that nature. Some people get into services. Now,
Mhm.
right now, obviously, Substack is a thing, but I don't think it's for that many people, frankly.
Mhm.
So you do have to think about the business model you're going to use to support your writing that will fill in the gaps until book sales can really spread out over the years. I would say you're looking at 5 to 10 years to see those book sales ramp up if things are going well.
Mhm.
And so much here depends on what you're writing. So if you're writing in romance, mystery, science fiction, and fantasy, romantasy, which is very popular right now, you have a you have a huge leg up. People are really buying those books. It's
Mhm.
not too hard to sell something in one of those categories compared to a Western or a memoir. Like, God help the memoirists if you're trying to make a living on that. It's probably not going to be through book sales, because how many memoirs can you sell? Not as
Mhm.
many as a romance author. I know that much. Um, so, yeah, there's just a lot of variables, and you have to think through what business model is going to support the writing you would want to do and what sort of market compromises you're willing to make.
So if it's so, I think that maybe the way that we're not thinking about it correctly is that somehow the writing the book is going to be the everything, and that
Right.
that's the goal, and maybe it's not even the goal, because that's a lot of, I mean, especially even with the ones that do produce book after book after book. I mean, that's um I mean, there's a lot of I mean, is that the kind of writer you want to be too? I mean, that there's
Yeah,
not a lot of art,
precisely.
or I don't know, freedom within that. It's, you know what I mean? You're on a, like, it's
I
like
mean,
you're always on a deadline, you know?
well, John Grisham produces at least a book a year. Is it two? I don't know, but like authors like him, they treat it like a job.
Mm-hmm.
Today I will produce 2,000 words, or
Mm-hmm.
however many it is, and it's. I'm not going to say it's not about art. I don't want to be. I don't want to make them sound like all they do is pump out words for commercial purposes. I think there is an art and craft to even a James Patterson novel that's ghostwritten. um, but I think where was I going with that? There's certainly a mentality, and this I think comes from more like the MFA side, the literary fiction side, um, that the words are precious, and I don't want, and the book is this work of art that I'm bestowing into the world. Um, but those aren't typically the sort of books that earn you a living.
Mm-hmm. So, but for you, I guess for you or for any author, is that the goal, that it's just it's the publishing the book that makes you a writer? Or are we to think about it as a writer, publishing the book as an aspect of who I am as a writer, but I also, like, you speak and you have a paid newsletter, which I guess is writing, um or you're coaching people, like, is that what you're suggesting we think about it more like?
I, th- I don't know if this will answer the question, but I do think the book is greatly overvalued by writers and by authors as a way to either make a living, express their perspective if it's nonfiction, produce art. I think, obviously, I'm not trying to denigrate the book. It's been with us for hundreds of years now, but there are 1 million books published every year. It's no great thing at this point to publish a book. Anyone can do it. It's essentially a button that you press. Like, that's how easy it has become. And there's obviously a lot of competition to be seen and read, reviewed. There are shrinking book review outlets, media coverage, etc. So you have to really think carefully, in my opinion, about why does this thing I have to say or this story I have to tell, why should it be a book? Should it be something else? Should it be a serialization? Would it do better as an email newsletter if you're nonfiction? Is it a YouTube series? Could it be a podcast? I'm not saying you should all go off and do these multimedia experiments, but I think too often, because of the authority that's been attached to the book, we immediately think, oh, book. But it's they're arguably overpublished at this point.
I mean, where is all of this headed? And I mean, that's like such a big question. But like in 5 to 10 years, like, will there be publishing agents anymore? Like, do you have like a take on where this is all going? Because it's like, it is flooded with, I mean, how are we going to find the books that are really meant for us in like this sort of super flooded market where there's really no checks and balances anymore, or a lot less so? Do you have do you have an opinion or like a prediction?
Well, I do know that quality doesn't necessarily rise to the top, so I don't think that phenomenon is going to save us. I mean, there are many ways that work gets noticed, and it's because it's usually pushed there. But as far as where is the publishing industry headed, I had a conversation with a colleague recently who said it was like watching the crumbling of the British Empire, watching traditional book publishing, but also by extension, book publishing generally, just because of all of the competition that we're facing. And I do think the book has been dethroned in some ways. This is not to say the book is dead. I do not believe that. I don't believe print is dead. I don't. It's just not the primary vehicle now for telling a story or spreading a message. It's one of many. And I don't know. I think we're going to see a lot of publishers having to change how they think about how they market books. I don't think they've figured out the solution for how to do that in an era where most books are bought online now, and the methods of discovery are shifting to influencers and it's out of the hands of critics and people who were the proper book people of 10 or 20 years ago.
I have one more question, and then do you have a few minutes to answer some of the questions in the chat? Yeah, I just want to be respectful of your time. So on the note of like Amazon versus everyone else that sells books, I'm continually shocked when I see new bookstores pop up, like Zibby's Books here in Santa Monica in California, where I am, and which is this little bookshop, to Barnes and Noble kind of reinventing themselves. They just opened a lovely new store in Marina del Rey here, which is just redesigned in a way that gives you a completely different experience. And so how is it that these bookstores are still popping up? I mean, how can they survive against, in the face of Amazon?
If they serve their communities well, I think there's a lot of consumer desire to support the local independent business. And I think there's also growing awareness that shopping at Amazon or buying books from Amazon is not contributing to a better culture or society.
Really?
Now, I buy it from Amazon like everyone else, but there are certain things I prefer not to buy there. And that's partly just because of terrible experiences, terrible quality, counterfeit products, etc.
Mhm.
So I think that is on bookstore side. But you raise an important point, which is the bookstore business model is very precarious. I mean, they operate on razor thin margins, and there's a lot of pressure on them to pay better wages. And it's because it's not a lucrative business, it's very tough to raise wages when their profit margins aren't increasing. So, part of what's the solution? I have no idea. There are
Mm.
people who talk about this at industry conferences, and I think some of it involves more concessions from the publishing companies themselves. There's also an issue here where Ingram has as big of a monopoly in publishing as Amazon. They have a monopoly on wholesaling and distribution of books. It's very hard for a bookstore to operate or for a publisher to operate without using Ingram, and they take a big chunk of the action
Mm.
financially.
Mm.
There aren't a lot of other places to go other than Ingram. So there are some really difficult to solve problems there.
Mhm.
But Barnes and Noble, they once they refocused on selling books rather than lots of other things that aren't books.
Mhm.
It seems like things started to improve. How funny. um, but I do think we're always going to have physical bookstores, but the percentage of books that are sold through bookstores is quite insignificant when you look at the percentage that are sold online.
Mhm. Mhm. Thank you for that. Okay, so a couple questions here. Can you share the names of any hybrid publisher you were happy with? Although you haven't worked directly with any of them. So,
I haven't, and this question betrays one of the problems with hybrid publishing generally. It will go well if only I can find a good one, or if I can only find one that Jane or some other expert approves of. There is no such company. Companies that I thought were good and that I have recommended, authors have been desperately unhappy with. So if you
mm,
ever think, see, or notice that Jane has endorsed or recommended a hybrid publisher, please contact me and so that I can clarify.
mm,
I'm certainly happy to share what I know, but there is not a hybrid company out there that doesn't have dissatisfied authors. That is just the nature of the business.
mhm,
It's not a knock even on the model. There are dissatisfied authors with every publishing company in the country, whether they're hybrid, traditional, or just a straight up service.
mhm,
So
mhm,
I think part of it is that authors go in without enough information, improper expectations, and then the publisher fails to communicate what they need to know to make the right decision.
mhm,
Um, I'm not sure anyone can be blamed, but I do think it is kind of folly to look for the publisher, the hybrid publisher that everyone has had a good experience with. It just doesn't exist.
mhm.
That said, I do have a resource list that I send to people who ask me this question. So if you reach out to me at the email address courses@janefriedman.com,
Mm,
I will send you that resource list and you can look at some of the companies I've listed.
mm,
But again, I have to emphasize there are still people who have had bad experiences with these companies.
mhm, mhm. Good to know. Thank you for that resource. Someone is saying, can you continue what you were saying about memoir? You started to explain about what happens with those who are not platform people. Um, do you
So
recall? Yeah.
I do. So, memoir falls in this really frustrating area where some agents and publishers want authors with platform and others would like it, but they might be willing to accept your project even without the platform. So the big problem here for memoirists is, do you try to build platform prior to pitching, or do you try to pitch, get rejected on lack of platform, and then try to build one to gain acceptance? And there's no right answer, I'm afraid. But I do think it is against your interests to build a platform to land a book deal.
Mm,
I don't think it typically ends well.
Mhm.
It's not that you shouldn't try, it's just that I think it gets you chasing your tail. If you're not already organically doing the sorts of things that would build you a platform for the book that you're pitching, will you be able to do it on a timeline that suits you to get your book published? And the other really frustrating thing is that agents and publishers will reject you on the basis of platform, even if that's not the reason they're rejecting you, because they think it's easier or maybe kinder than telling you, I don't like your story, or I can't publish another cancer memoir this year, or
Mhm.
whatever that reason is.
Mhm. Right. It's an easy out, right? It's easy.
Yeah.
When is your next book? When is the updated version of Business of Being a Writer going to be published?
If everything goes well, it'll be out about this time next year. So we're going to be launching it at AWP 2025. That's going to be in Los Angeles
It
next year.
is?
Mhm.
What year? What month is it? March? Is it always in?
It's like March or April, somewhere
Okay.
in that vicinity.
How did I not know that? Okay. More about Substacking. First of all, I have a question for you about your latest Substack article. How do you decide what you're going to share freely and openly, like an article like that, versus something that's behind a paywall, or that you should be paid for because it's incredibly useful information. Like, or is
Sure.
that really how you're establishing yourself as an expert, far and wide, and that's part of your thinking?
The hot sheet is a combination of summaries and analysis of publishing news that does, I think, age. Like there are certain aspects of that
Mm.
newsletter at the beginning and at the closing that in a year's time, no, it's not
Irrelevant.
going to
Yeah.
matter.
Hmm.
Um, and then for those who aren't familiar with it, there are usually three key items that are longer and that are reported. And it usually means I've made some phone calls or sent some emails, or I've listened to a session, or, I'm having to do some research in order to pull those together. So, for instance, the next issue coming out next week is looking at, in terms of election year books, 2024, what does it look like this year versus what did it look like in 2020? And the big takeaway is there are no election year deals in Publishers Marketplace for this 2024 election, which pales in comparison to where we were at in 2020. Now, why is that? And so the article discusses why.
Wow.
So all that to say, the Substack article that I put up for free at my own website, I sat down on a Saturday afternoon and typed that out without having to do any research. It was in my head. It's like, this is something that all writers need to know. And I'm
Wow.
tired of saying it in 5,000 small little places. And
I
I need
see.
to put it together in one place. And then when I get questions like in this
About
session,
Substack, yes. I
like,
just posted
please
it.
read this.
Yes, please read this.
um,
Whoever posted that question.
yeah. Yeah. So the
Got it.
stuff that's really broadly applicable, education that needs to happen, and now like my own counseling or business advice, that's all free. But if you want like the industry analysis about political books publishing in the election year, you'll have to pay.
Got it. Okay. This says a slightly dense question about the sliding scale of publishing and making money, especially given your very awesome table. I've seen and heard of authors that self-publish and then get picked up by traditional publishing or maybe mid-size publisher, get to keep their own digital rights, and then have traditional marketing power / support. Do you think this could lead to more long-term financial stability? Do you think that this pattern is changing the way people look at self-publishing? To me, this says that self-publishing is becoming more of a proving ground for people to get large publishing deals. Would you agree with that?
I do. I basically agree with that. Yes. I mean, it's encouraging on the one hand, because if you can demonstrate there's an audience for your work. This is no small thing. It takes usually, 3 to 5 years of putting out multiple titles. But if you can show there's an audience for your work and you would like the partnership of a traditional house, you can probably have that. Traditional publishers are very happy to take a portion of your profits, and not, they still have to do work, of course, but that they didn't have to build it from the ground up. They're only too happy to step in and make you even bigger. And this is actually something that I wrote about in my paid newsletter last month. There's an imprint at Sourcebooks, which is a fairly significant publisher at this point. They have an imprint called Bloom Books that this is basically what they do. They partner with self-publishing authors. The self-publishing authors keep their digital rights. Bloom Books typically is doing all of the print distribution. The author may or may not, be handing them other types of rights. Often the agent is selling foreign rights or other types of sub rights. And so it is really a true collaboration in that sense. But Bloom Books isn't just picking up any self-publishing author who comes to the door. So while generally I think I like seeing this, on the flip side, it does put some concern. I feel worry in my heart for the authors who they're just not entrepreneurial. Not every author can do what some of these authors have done. I'll mention like Lucy Score, Anna Huang, E.L. James, the original. These sorts of authors are fantastic businesswomen in some regard. And they really know how to write for their market, and they understand the business of their readership in a way that brings knowledge into the traditional publishing house. And
I see.
Your average memoirist, I don't think that's realistic.
It's whole different skill sets, really, okay. So there just seems to be like a persistent questions about Substack. So if you're starting a new newsletter, is there a reason not to do it on Substack? Is there a reason to do it on your own, separate from Substack? Say that you say that you have no intention to pay, like to do a paywall. Why not do it on like an established platform like that? Is there a reason not to?
So I'll go through the pros and cons. Let's assume you're not published, you're unknown, and part of your goal is to have an easier launch, maybe build up subscribers a little faster, and also not pay, which is that's a pro of Substack, is that you're not paying, at least not yet. So Substack is unique in that it offers you this social layer, a recommendation layer. And if you're already reading lots of Substacks, if you're already commenting on Substacks, if you know the people there, if you've got buddies, writing buddies who are there, why not go and start your newsletter on their platform? But, it's not, you don't own this tool. And I personally have been burned in the past by startups that have lots of venture funding, like this company does, and then they change the rules on you, or they pivot to a different business model, or any number of things can happen that upset the apple cart in small and large ways. So you just have to be ready for change. As of today, they allow you to export your email list. So if something happens and you become unhappy, at least you can go and take those names somewhere else and continue. But you're going to leave behind your archive of newsletters. You can probably export them, but there's always a penalty when you switch services, and you're going to, what else might you lose? Well, Substack also is interested in gathering a very significant reading community in addition to the writers or the creators. So there are some people who only read through the app. They're not actually giving over their email address necessarily. There are people who will just get trained to come and visit without handing over the email address, et cetera, et cetera. So just realize that you're building an audience for Substack in part, and it's to their benefit to lock everyone in to their platform because it creates value for them. I'm not saying this is evil. That's just it's part of their business, and they want to sell their business for a lot of money. So just realize what you're contributing to. Use it for your own purposes if you can. Use it for free. Let's hope it remains free. And then if you need to bail later, be prepared to do that.
So why not just do it somewhere else? You're saying it's the community aspect, that you can benefit from the community aspect, because with all of that, I'm like, well, just go start your own newsletter. Like, don't even sort of, enter into that game.
Yeah, Substack offers the promise of there's more discoverability, there's these social features. And if you go start your email newsletter on a MailChimp or a ConvertKit, it doesn't take long before you have to pay a monthly fee. The free tier is very limited, if it exists at all. So some people just don't want to be paying that money, especially if, they're not even making money off of their writing career at this point.
Makes sense. Hope that answered your questions. And last question here, any hot suggestions for preparing book proposals? I know on Jane's site, she's got, again, an enormous amount of resources that you share. And I think there's one specifically on book proposals, no?
There's a dedicated post on book proposals along with a template that I recommend using. What I hear from agents right now repeatedly is it's a tough market. It's a tough market. It's a tough market. And there was even an agent who, Kate McKean, who wrote about what does that mean when people say it's a tough market. And so as of today, if you have a book proposal that you're sending out, the bar might feel higher or be higher in getting that project accepted. So what does that mean? You need to have a really good marketing plan. Do not just put down a few vague bullet points, have it really well developed. You want to make sure that you understand your comparable titles and that you're choosing them in a way that's realistic. Obviously, that could be its own hour-long session, but you want to, the bottom line there is just showing that you understand the shelf that you're entering into and why another book is needed on that shelf, why people are going to buy it. And if you're not a memoirist, you definitely have to be demonstrating your platform. I don't mean social media. I mean how your visibility to the readership of that book, by whatever means, that's going to lend confidence to the publisher that the book will sell when it reaches the market.
Makes sense. So lastly, what's the most exciting thing for us as storytellers moving forward, to your mind? And on a positive note, freedom.
Freedom. I mean, when I first entered the industry, there wasn't a whole lot of movement, room for movement. The paths were very narrow, and if you were rejected from traditional paths, it was very hard to do anything else. And that's no longer the case. The flip side of that is that you've now got the burden of choice, and people are fearful that they might make the wrong decision about a project. Or, should they go hybrid? Should they self-publish? Should they do a Substack? Like there's the paradox of choice. It doesn't necessarily make things easier. But I think in the end, it's to writers' benefits that they have these different options that they can pursue. And just because one thing doesn't work out, one path doesn't work out, doesn't mean you can't try something else.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been a pleasure, really, to meet you and talk with you. So appreciate you being here.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for coming to listen.